Hey, friends, family, church family, members of churches that I have served in the past or the church I'm serving now, and people from the internet who I don't really know. I want to talk to all of you today about the split, the schism, the separation of the United Methodist Church. And you may have heard something about this, or maybe you haven't if nobody's mentioned it to you. United Methodist Church has had a kind of a split scheduled at the next General Conference, whenever that's going to be. We've had some delayed conferences, and so I want to talk about what's going on with that. I want you guys to be able to get informed or to at least ask well-informed questions. And so what I want to do to the best of my ability, and if you're watching this and you know that I'm leaving something out or I've misstated something or whatever, I want everybody to have good information. So be sure to put that in the comments or share links to articles that do a better job than what I've done, because I do want people to have their best information. So I want to give basically an introduction to what's going on and some of the issues that are at stake and at play here. I want to do a brief historical overview of how we got here, looking at the whole history of the church, but especially the last few years, and then talk about recent developments, and then talk about what are some options for local congregations and church members going forward. So the United Methodist Church is a worldwide denomination. It's a Christian church with about 13 million members around the world. About half of them are in the United States. And the institution as we know it today, the United Methodist Church, was formed in 1968 by a merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren. That's where we got the word united. Now, the EUB Church was basically a German-speaking Wesleyan or Methodist body that after a couple generations didn't speak German anymore, so they merged. The Methodist Church was kind of the successor to the original Methodist Episcopal Church. You may remember Methodism started as a revival movement, kind of a disciplined, organized revival within Anglicanism, the Church of England. And at the time of the American Revolution, John Wesley sent a bishop over to help organize the Methodist Episcopal Church. And it went through several kind of little splits and then a big split in the lead up to the Civil War. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, there were some reunions and some mergers. So the Methodist Church, the EUB Church, merged in 1968 to give us what we today call the United Methodist Church. And beginning at the very next General Conference is a gathering of delegates from all over the world, from the church everywhere, and usually it's a little less than 1,000 delegates. And General Conference is the highest decision-making body of the church. They make policy, they express what the church believes and what the church's rules, canon law, discipline is going to be. So the General Conference typically meets every 4 years, and so 1972 was the next General Conference, and it was the first General Conference where we began to debate and argue about homosexuality, sexual morality, and the definition of marriage. And if you've been following this at all, you know that that really is the presenting issue for this split, the schism. And at every single General Conference since 72, this issue has been debated more and more and more, and the debates have been heated and angry, and every single General Conference has reaffirmed the classic teaching of the Christian church, the historic consensus teaching, the teaching of the whole, the Catholic, the universal church across denominations, across ages, and across cultures. Which is that marriage is a union of one man and one woman, and it is the only place for sexual intimacy. And this does make homosexuality forbidden or ruled out for us, but also a whole lot of other things that are actually more commonly practiced in our culture today. So that's what has come to be known as the traditionalist position, and it's the position that every single General Conference has continued to reaffirm. Now, the other wing of the church, and there are, of course, people who are in between who don't really want to be in any wing, but the other big wing of the church is what we might call the progressive. So you got the traditional, conservative, evangelical wing, and then you got the progressive or liberal wing. And the progressive or liberal wing sees those traditional teachings as a problem. They see in the Bible a trajectory toward greater and greater inclusion, that's really what the gospel is all about. And so they see the traditional classic teachings of Christianity on this issue as a barrier to that full inclusion, that greater inclusion. And so even though the classic teachings are found in the New Testament itself, I would say rather clearly, they would see that as anti-gospel. And so there's been this debate, but I believe very firmly that the issue of sexual morality is really the presenting issue. There's a deeper issue, and maybe you can already kind of tell, and that deeper issue has to do with how do we understand the Bible, how do we read and interpret the Bible, how do we apply biblical authority in the life of the church. And traditionalists are saying, well, we've got this sort of classical way we've always done this, and it's what we get with John Wesley and going all the way back, the medieval saints and St. Francis and early church fathers, and the progressives are saying that we need to do that in a different way. And so there's this divide that's really over biblical authority. And you go back to the Protestant Reformation, you go back to other times of split in the church. This is often what it does come back to. And so we've come to the point of a split, a schism in the United Methodist Church. And I want to trace the history of that. But before I do, I just want to say, personally, I was confirmed in the United Methodist Church about 30 years ago. I have worked in one capacity or another in the United Methodist Church for almost my entire adult life, for about 20 years, about 15 years of which I've been a pastor. And this United Methodist Church has been my spiritual home for all these years. I love United Methodism. I love the way it tries to bring together different strands of Christian tradition, that we're, sacramental and evangelical, that we're Reformed and Catholic, that we try to hold these things together, and we've tried to do that on the way we hold these traditional teachings, that we are, as John chapter 1 says about Jesus himself, we're trying to be filled with grace and truth, and not drop either one of those, right? We want to hold the traditional teachings, but unlike some fundamentalist churches that beat people up and make people feel guilty and terrible all the time, we want to hold these teachings with grace and with a posture of graciousness and welcome toward everybody, because all of us are sinners. All of us need the grace of Jesus, and that nobody, we shouldn't see ourselves as any better than anybody else just because we happen to struggle with different kinds of temptations. And so we want to hold that grace and that truth together. We want that sort of generous or gracious orthodoxy. We want to speak the truth in love, right? I believe that's a very biblical approach, and it's one of the things I really appreciate about United Methodism and the way that we have tried to walk this line on these very difficult issues. So that's kind of where we are. I briefly overviewed the history. In the last 20 years or so, as I said, the General Conference has reaffirmed the classical teachings. Going back to the merger in 1968, from the beginning, the United Methodist Church was really a pretty big tent denomination. It had people with a lot of different views in it, which is why we started fighting immediately, right? But the idea was that we were going to have a common structure that would hold us all together. And so even to this day, if you hear somebody talking about United Methodism and about our church and kind of what holds our church together, we do have common doctrinal standards, but often what people will go to first when they start describing our church is the structure. They'll start talking about connectionalism, and they'll start talking about the way we assign clergy and the way we support boards and agencies and mission sending agencies and all this, and that the structures are really what hold us together. Now, and the highest structure is the General Conference itself. So in the year 2000, this debate had gotten so heated that some of the traditionalists and conservatives said, hey, maybe it's time for us to start talking about an amicable way to go our separate ways. We can't walk together if we're going to walk in different directions, so let's figure out a good way to do that gracefully. The General Conference of 2000 rejected that. The delegates thought that was not what they wanted to do, and so the debates kind of continued to boil over a little bit. In 2016, one of the other issues in the life of the church is the struggles of the church in the United States. That's where about half the membership is, but it has struggled to grow in many parts of the country. So even though it is growing in some places in the U.S., it's declining in others. And on the whole, the U.S. church is declining in numbers, while the church in some other parts of the world, particularly Africa and Asia, is experiencing booming growth. And so every time we get together for General Conference, this worldwide assembly, there are fewer American delegates that tend to lean more progressive as a whole, though there are lots of traditionalists in the U.S., especially in the South, and depends on what part of the country you're in. And then but there would be fewer progressive delegates, fewer American delegates, and more conservative delegates, more African, more Asian delegates, more delegates from other parts of the country, and so other parts of the world. And so this is the demographic trend over time. And so we got to the 2016 General Conference, and with those demographics in view, it looked like we were getting close to the point where the majority of the church was actually going to be outside of the U.S. in those very quick growing and very traditional leaning parts of the worldwide church. And so it really did feel like for a lot of us, I think on all sides of this issue, that if the progressives were going to get the church teachings changed and moved in a more liberal direction, 2016, it was kind of like now or never. And the 2016 General Conference did reaffirm the classical historic consensus, the traditional teaching. And there was certainly a lot of anger and animosity, and it really felt like things were starting to fray. And so the 2016 General Conference, seeing this happening, and hearing delegates and church leaders saying, well, if that's what we're going to vote to do, I'm not going to obey the General Conference. And so there was this fear that the structure that holds us all together was beginning to lose support, and it was going to break down. And so the General Conference 2016 created a special commission, the Bishops' Commission on the Way Forward, to come up with a plan for us to walk forward on this issue, and try to stay united. And that commission was going to come up with a plan and then have a special called session of the General Conference in 2019 to deal just with what's going to be the way forward on this one issue or this debate. And so the commission came up essentially with three options. There was one option that was more what the progressives wanted, which was to eliminate all of the historic teachings on marriage, sexuality, homosexuality, and what kind of weddings can be performed in our churches, and to eliminate all that, let local churches, local pastors, local conferences, annual conferences, which for us is the state of Louisiana as our annual conference, under the leadership of one bishop, an annual conference deploys clergy to the local churches, and let them just kind of do whatever they wanted on these issues. There would be no official teaching. And then there was another plan called the traditionalist plan, which was going to essentially reaffirm the classical teaching and create greater accountability for those who did not uphold the Book of Discipline. Because one of the issues we were having increasingly was pastors, despite the fact that we took ordination vows to uphold the teachings of the Book of Discipline, whatever we may think about them, and even some bishops whose job is to keep good order in the church and make sure that everyone does keep their ordination vows. Increasingly, bishops and pastors were simply saying, we're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to uphold parts of the Book of Discipline that we see as unjust. And so that's what the progressives were saying. And traditionalists, on the other hand, were feeling like, how can we be in a covenant relationship with people who are breaking their covenant vows? And so you can see how this was kind of coming apart. So so you had the one church plan, which was going to let local churches, congregations, pastors, and conferences do whatever they wanted. The traditional plan was going to reaffirm our teachings and enhance the accountability for anyone who did not keep their ordination vows. There was another plan that was part of it that was really kind of a middle way, but it was very cumbersome and got very little support. So we had this special called session of General Conference in 2019 to deal with these issues. And they essentially had before them the same binary options that they always had, and did not surprise me at all that they reaffirmed the traditional plan. That's where the majority of the church is. And so they affirmed the traditional plan. And coming out of that special general conference of 2019, a lot of traditionalists were kind of like, all right, I guess we're done, right? We made a decision and that's the way we're going to go. And I guess probably a lot of progressives are going to leave the church. The 2019 conference did create a way where congregations could leave the church. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But the progressive wing of the church said, no way, Jose, we are not leaving at all, and we are not going to abide by this plan. And so 2020, the 2020 General Conference was the next normally scheduled General Conference. So in 2019, we were electing delegates for 2020, and that was the last in-person annual conference I attended in Louisiana to elect delegates for 2020 General Conference. And it was the most politicized and divided annual conference meeting I've ever been to. And that kind of politicized spirit, can kind of take on an energy of its own, and it was not good for us in terms of trying to be gracious with one another. It was not good for our spirit of unity. And so the progressive wing, though, they mobilized in a way that I have never seen them do before, and worked hard to get their people elected as delegates for the 2020 General Conference, because they were going to overturn this traditional plan, right? We were just going to keep on fighting this thing out. And so that's kind of where we were in the summer of 2019, after the special session of General Conference. It didn't solve the issues. People were just more angry and more determined to kind of win. And we had more clergy and more bishops talking about how they were simply not going to do what the General Conference says. They weren't going to keep their ordination vows. They weren't going to do what the Book of Discipline teaches because they saw it as unjust. They disagreed with it. And so late 2019, a group of bishops and large church pastors and people whose voices just carry weight in the different wings of the church informally and with a professional mediator got together, and they hammered out a protocol for separation as kind of an offer to the church, like, consider this. And the protocol for separation was a plan to divide the United Methodist Church, as I said, into at least two new denominations. And so one denomination is going to keep the name United Methodist and most of the assets and the general boards and agencies and things like that. And it would become a progressive or liberal denomination. And the other big denomination was the Global Methodist Church, that was going to become a traditional denomination. It was probably going to pick up, the idea was, most of the international conferences around the world. The United Methodist Church going forward would no longer be as much a worldwide diversity as more of an American and progressive church. And the GMC would kind of continue to have that diversity that we currently have in the UMC, and it would also keep the same teachings and doctrines and discipline that we currently have in the UMC. So it would in some ways be more of a continuation of the UMC, even though it had a different name. And in other ways, it would be different. So the protocol for separation gained support from leaders on all sides of the debates, conservative, liberal, traditionalist, progressive, centrist, moderate, whatever. And there was a very real sense that this thing was going to pass at General Conference in May of 2020. But you all know what happened, right? We had a global pandemic that nobody expected. And so the protocol, the General Conference got delayed. And I think it got delayed twice. There's been so many delays, it's hard to keep it straight. But it was delayed ultimately to September of 2022, this year, this coming September. And some of the issues that are at play in all of this they're very important for people in the local church to keep in mind is the ownership of church property. In the United Methodist Church, as it's currently structured and constituted, the local congregation, yes, they buy the property, they build the church, they maintain the property, but they do not own the property. They hold it in trust for the denomination, but the denomination owns the property. And this is the legal mechanism whereby the bishop can say, here's who your pastor is going to be, and they got the keys to the building. So it's how that appointment process works, where the bishops can send pastors. That's the sort of leverage they have for that. So if a congregation wants to leave the UMC and affiliate with another denomination, the Global Methodist Church or any other denomination, they have to lose their property. And so part of what the protocol for separation was trying to do was create a system where congregations and even whole annual conferences, if they chose to, could leave the denomination. So what would happen, and keep their properties. So what would happen is the protocol would pass, and then your annual conference, for us, that's Louisiana, would vote. Do we want to stay in what they were calling the post-separation UMC, the PSUMC, and become essentially a more progressive church on some of the hot-button issues that are being debated? Or do we want to leave the post-separation UMC and join another body, presumably the Global Methodist Church, but there were other options that have been talked about, and I'll come back to that too. And maintain the historic traditional teachings and be able to take our properties with us. So the conferences that would move to the other denomination and leave the UMC, or local churches that would leave their conferences if they didn't like the way they went, would keep their properties. And so if you were, for example, a progressive church in a conservative conference, and that conference left the UMC, and you didn't want to stay with your conference, you could join a different conference and stay in the UMC, PSUMC, post-separation. And so this would allow you to keep your church property while you did it. Now, another kind of legal issue with the protocol for separation is the pension plan. Churches and pastors have paid into the pension plan, and people going in both directions would be vested in the pension plan. And so it was kind of like, if you leave the denomination right now, you're kind of leaving the pension plan. And if enough people did that, the pension plan might actually become unsustainable. And so, and there are all these fiduciary responsibilities. And so part of the deal was that all the new denominations out of the separation would share the pension plan, and maybe share UMCOR, the relief agency, and some other general boards and agencies. Okay, so everybody really thought, we had progressives and conservatives and traditionalists who were lining up to support this protocol. And there were some things about it that conservatives did not like, because it did require a 57% vote for an annual conference to go and leave the UMC and affiliate with another denomination. And that was kind of like you could have a kind of progressive minority holding a majority captive, as it were. It was kind of stacked in such a way that if you didn't do anything, or the path of least resistance was going to be to stay in the post-separation UMC and become a progressive church. And a lot of conservatives were like, if we're the majority, why is that happening? But that's the plan they came up with, and that seemed to be the only plan that would get buy-in and support from all quarters of the church. And so it did. And so we all thought it was going to pass in 2020, and that we were going to start making these votes in late 2020. The pandemic came, everything got delayed. So what's come up recently is that the General Commission on General Conference met in, I think, February, and they had presumably been planning for a 2022 General Conference, and they met and voted to delay the General Conference. It was a closer than usual vote for these kinds of things. They voted to delay the General Conference 2 further years to 2024. And this raised all kinds of questions. And people didn't just shrug and say, oh, I guess it's just another COVID delay. People really, at least on the traditional wing, and I think to some extent on the progressive wing, were unhappy with this delay for a number of reasons. For one thing, the General Commission on General Conference, a person who served on that commission came off the commission, and it's about 25 people, and said they were planning a 2022 General Conference, but there were no good faith efforts made to actually try to have a conference this year. They were supposed to be tracking vaccine status of delegates in other countries, and that wasn't done. They had been contacted by someone from another Methodist denomination who had successfully pulled off a General Conference, and who volunteering to help us do it, and that person was never called back. And also that they voted to delay to 2024 the 2020 General Conference, rather than just canceling it, and because we would normally have a 2024 General Conference anyway, definitely raised a lot of eyebrows. And some people said, well, they are trying to avoid having new elections for new delegates because they know with each passing year there are more overseas Methodists compared to American Methodists, and there are more conservative Methodists compared to traditional Methodists. So it's an attempt to suppress the African vote or an attempt to suppress the conservative vote. So some people raised those questions. Another question that was raised was, the Global Methodist Church, the GMC, this traditionalist body, the protocol for separation said that the UMC post-separation was going to keep boards and agencies and assets, but give a big infusion of cash to launch the GMC. Well, the GMC set a launch date for 2022, and now they're going to be launching without that infusion of cash and with far fewer congregations than would have been the case if the General Conference also happened in 2022. And so some people saw that as maybe a deliberate attempt to hamstring the launch of the GMC. And a lot of people that I've talked to, clergy, even a former district superintendent, really earnestly believe that a lot of the people who initially supported the protocol for separation back when it was announced have since then kind of done the math and looked at the figures, and they've realized that so much of the church was going to go traditional and leave that the post-separation United Methodist Church was going to be fiscally unsustainable. And I definitely believe, just looking at it myself, that the future of the UMC as an institution was going to be, all their conferences were going to be dominated by cutting budgets and laying off staff and consolidating agencies and making cuts, while the new denomination was going to be doing the opposite. They were going to be creating new mission agencies and maybe new seminaries and new programs. And for me, that sounded a lot more exciting, actually, as how we were going to be spending our conference time, right? So I think some people are saying that people who initially supported the protocol for separation are now actively working to try to prevent it from happening, because they think if it is allowed to happen, the post-separation UMC is going to be financially unsustainable. And so when this delay was announced, a lot of people felt like it was not just a COVID delay, but that there was political maneuvering. And so people have started heading for the exits. You've got people who are my age, who are just a couple of years older, talking about retirement. You've got pastors, even in our conference, who are surrendering their credentials, essentially resigning their ministerial office. You've got churches, congregations that are very actively talking about leaving the denomination now, rather than waiting for the General Conference. And I know of some that have all but decided that already. And I don't know if that's just a handful of congregations or if it's a lot at this point. I think it could turn into a lot. We'll see what happens. So if the protocol for separation won't pass until 2024 at best, and part of the issue is a lot of people think this is an attempt to undermine the protocol, and a lot of more attempts are going to be made in that direction. And so a lot of people are less confident that the protocol will pass in 2024. Now, where I'm sitting, I think it's probably still better than 50-50 odds that it will pass, but I'm less confident than I was a year ago that it will pass at all. And so now we come back to that clause at the special session in 2019 that they added to the Book of Discipline to allow churches to leave now. It would require them to pay their unfunded pension liabilities. And that clause has a sunset on it. Churches have to decide if they want to leave by the end of 2023. But General Conference has now been delayed, not just to 2023, which I think might have made sense, but all the way to 2024. And so if churches don't leave under the current provision, there's no guarantee that the protocol for separation is going to pass. And this is why a lot of churches are now saying, let's just go ahead and pay the unfunded pension liability, even if it's a huge sum of money, and let's leave now, because at least that way we're done with this whole debate. We've got certainty. We own our property, and we know we're kind of in control of our own future as a congregation. So That's what some congregations are talking about doing. And ironically, or maybe, instead of the GMC launching with a big infusion of cash from the UMC, it's now the case that conservative churches are leaving the UMC and giving a big infusion of cash back to the UMC in order to kind of buy their way out. And again, some people, rightly or wrongly, maybe they've been burned a bunch of times by broken promises from church leaders in the past, so now they're just cynical. But some people see that as that was by design, and that was the purpose of the delay. So, so here's where we are now. We don't know if General Conference will happen in 2024, but I think that's almost certainly it will. We don't know if the protocol for separation will pass in 2024. And so we do know that many traditional-leaning churches are looking for exits right now. And so we don't know how many that will be. We don't know if it's going to be so many churches that it swings the kind of General Conference votes. But we don't know. So what are your options going forward? Okay, if you're progressive, you don't really need to do much. Just kind of sit tight and see what happens, right? If you do nothing, the path of least resistance is you're probably going to end up in a denomination called the United Methodist Church that will have new teachings, and it will be a progressive church. And so you don't have to do much. Now, if you're moderately conservative or more conservative-leaning, a little or a lot, you may also find that is the path of least resistance, and maybe that's attractive to you because you don't want to fight about this, you don't want to have contentious debates in your local congregation, but you do need to consider a few things. You know, it's not just the marriage issue. Maybe you're on the fence on that issue, and you don't feel like fighting over it one way or the other. When the conservatives, by and large, are gone, the church is going to shift pretty, I think, dramatically to the left. So, yes, our teachings on marriage and sexuality are going to change, and that means there could be gay marriages in your church building. That means you could be assigned a pastor who's living in a same-sex relationship, and they would live in your parsonage and everything. But it's not just the sexual issues. You know, the teaching on abortion is going to shift dramatically. I think almost certainly is going to shift dramatically in a pro-choice, pro-abortion kind of direction. The denomination there are currently some restrictions on what kinds of social causes or political causes the church can give money to. Right? We can't give money to support things that are contrary to our church teachings. And we voted to not give money, for example, on the abortion issue to the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice. And I think those restrictions are going to be taken away. So what are you willing for your tithe dollars to be spent on? As the general church moves to the left, they're going to be, you know, funding different kinds of ministries, as they see it as ministries, that may not be in keeping with your values. And so what kind of stands is the church going to take on hot-button contentious issues, you know, whether biological males should be competing against females in high school athletics. We've seen some other denominations have gone progressive on the marriage issue, begin taking stands on those issues that might not be the stands you would like to read in the newspaper that your church is taking, and people whose salaries you are paying, right? So what kind of stands is the church going to take? What kind of clergy are you going to get assigned? You know, there was a case a year or so ago in, I think it's the Illinois Great Rivers Conference. They approved for ministry a drag queen, and that made the news. If you're a kind of more conservative-leaning congregation, probably you're not going to be topping their list of who they're going to send their drag queen clergy to, probably. But it is going to be the case that the pool of clergy, and indeed the seminaries that train them, it's going to be a smaller pool, and it is going to be a more progressive-leaning as a group. And so who's going to be preaching to you on Sunday mornings? What kind of theology are they going to teach? Who's going to be teaching your confirmation class to your kids and grandkids, right? What kind of even theology is going to be in there in the little upper room daily devotion guides? You can expect the church is going to shift progressive left theologically, culturally, and socially on a whole lot of issues in addition to marriage. So if you're a traditionalist and you're saying, I don't think I can live, you might say, I can live with that. It's my church and I'm sticking with it. But if you say, I don't think I can live with that, what are my options? One option is to wait until 2024 and see if the protocol for separation passes, and then you can vote as a congregation to leave with your property with fairly minimal expense if the protocol passes. Another option is, and you might want to watch what happens in the annual conference level to see if it looks like the support for the protocol is beginning to wane. Because I know there are going to be resolutions at a lot of annual conferences saying, we still support the protocol, and let's see if those resolutions pass or not. Or if you don't want to wait, you can say, we're going to go ahead under the current provision before the end of 2023, and we're going to decide to leave. And we're going to figure out what our unfunded pension liability is and see if that's something we can pay, or at least explore that possibility. If you decide to leave the UMC, where can you go? Well, the GMC is the Global Methodist Church is going to launch, I think, May 1st of 2022. And that is going to be, it is set up to receive United Methodist churches and United Methodist clergy, and it's going to have a system very similar to our current system. And in some ways, though, they are trying to harken back to some of the lingo and some of the structures of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the early days when it was really growing. And I like the way they're thinking on some of that. There was some talk at one point about radically changing the itineracy, the process of how pastors get assigned, to give the local pastor and the local congregation really more control over that process. I think, and correct me, some of you guys who are in the know, if I'm wrong on this, it sounds like they've kind of backed away from that, and they're kind of saying now, let's just launch the GMC and get it going and have a general conference and see who's there, and then talk about if and how we want to reform the itineracy. I think the itineracy needs to be reformed. And so that's very attractive to me, but the fact that they've kind of backed away from that is disappointing. Another possibility, so you got the Global Methodist Church. Another possibility is one that was just announced a couple of weeks ago, and this is the Anglican Church in North America, which is a more traditional-leaning denomination. They came out of the Episcopal Church, and they've already been through this whole process. They are creating what they're calling the Aldersgate Mission Society, and it is going to be a body to receive United Methodist clergy and United Methodist churches. And they will be a Methodist body within the Anglican Church in North America. And it's kind of hearkening back to the original Methodist movement, which was this sort of disciplined, organized revival movement within Anglicanism. They're trying to kind of make that possibility open again to United Methodists. And so I'm fairly certain that for churches that go this route, you will have complete ownership of your buildings, free and clear. In the Global Methodist Church, there'll be a lien placed against your property to make sure that you continue to pay into the pensions, is my understanding. And in the Aldersgate Mission Society, my understanding is that you'll have more of a call system for clergy deployment. So congregations will hire their own pastors and keep them as long as they're happy with them. So you won't have the itinerant system at all, which you probably will have in the Global Methodist Church in some form. So that might be attractive, just on a practical level, the Aldersgate Mission Society within the Anglican Church in North America. I hope to get more information on that as it comes out, because it's still pretty new, so we don't know a lot of details yet. So those are two potential landing places. Other congregations have already left, and they've joined other smaller Methodist churches, like the Free Methodist Church or the Evangelical Methodist Church, and some of our clergy have gone those ways. So there are a lot of places you could land, and they're all going to have different standards and different processes. So as a congregation and as individual people, United Methodists, I think we really need to start paying a little more attention, praying about these issues. What do I think is best for the future of my church? What do I want my church to look like? What do I think the people around me who sit down the pew from me, what do they want their church to look like, right? And be praying about this. If your congregation goes in a direction that you don't like, are you going to stay with that congregation? I've had people come tell me, if our congregation ends up in a progressive denomination, whatever the name be, they're out. And some of you might feel that way, or some of you might feel like, I wouldn't like it, but I'd stick with my congregation. You need to be thinking about those things. And another thing that I think is really important, and I want to kind of end with this. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air right now, and that can create a lot of anxiety, and that can create a lot of mistrust, and that can create a situation where we are not being very charitable with one another. The Bible has a lot to teach about many things. Yes, sexuality and marriage, but a whole lot of other things as well. And I think how we interact with each other, how we interact with that gay couple that comes to visit our worship service, needs to be governed by these other teachings in the Bible as well, right? Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to anger. We need to interact with one another and try to have these conversations in a way that is grace-filled, in a way that's patient, in a way that honors the Word of God as best we can. I want to honor the Word of God on all of its teachings, whether it's a hot-button issue or not a hot-button issue at all, and something everybody basically agrees on. We need to honor the Word of God. And how we have these conversations and how we pray for each other, even people we disagree with, even leaders we may disagree with, there's an opportunity to be faithful to our Lord Jesus and to honor the Word of God, and how we navigate this process and how we have these conversations, how we wrestle through these issues together, being willing to have that grace-filled spirit. And whatever you do, and whatever choice you make, I want to encourage you to do that. I hope this has been helpful. If I left something important out, or you have further questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Please share this video if you have people in your church or a sister church across town that you think need to be kind of in the loop on all this. And until we connect again, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you and fill you with His peace.